Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to be looking at the February 1925 issue of Weird Tales. So the cover has perhaps something we're more expecting from a pulp magazine cover. Two people confronting what appears to be a demon or devil of some sort rising from some flames. We're told the cover story is called Whispering Tunnels. The bottom left-hand corner tells us it's a Devil Tale of Verdun by Stephen Bagby. Let's go into the issue. We'll look at this story and others. The table of content tells us there's 24 stories, including a couple of serials. The first story is the cover story, Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This is set in 1923, so 5 years after World War I. And it concerns an American who is looking for a comrade of his, can't seem to find him, visits the fortifications where he was stationed, finds out people think he's a traitor. While staying overnight as a guest of the commanding officer, he will see a ghostly apparition of his friend. He will then talk to someone he knows, a professor who studies the supernatural, who believes that there's great evil there that needs to be exorcised. They do some more research as to what happened exactly during the war at this fort. So I'm not going to go into more detail. One problem with this story is that part of what people think is supernatural has a natural explanation, and yet there is a supernatural thing, that demon that gets exorcised. I think this confuses the story more than anything. It would have been better for everything to have the same supernatural cause or everything to have a naturalistic explanation. Unfortunately, the ending is what fell flat. The rest was captivating enough. Next, we have Crossed Lines by Robert G. Bowie and Robinson H. Harsh. This is a story of two people who, after an accident, find out they've exchanged bodies. So each one's spirit is in the other's body. The narrator sees himself as quite virtuous, and the person whose body he's taken to be quite the scoundrel. He sees his life being destroyed by the person inhabiting his body while he is sort of helpless. One little twist is they can't be very far apart physically, or they might both lose not just their bodies but their lives. There have been some better stories with this theme. This one had a nice little constraint. Next is A Broken Lamp-Chimney by Arthur J. Burks. And as I said when I was talking about the last issue, I really disliked every single story this person has written. I didn't even bother to read this one. If you go through this issue, I do recommend skipping it, like you should skip the other stories by this person. It's followed by The Tomb Dweller by Alice I. Fuller. This story starts with a protagonist who greatly enjoys spending time in cemeteries, and when his parents pass away, he's left with enough of an inheritance that he's essentially independently wealthy. He can travel around as he will, and he decides he's just going to go from town to town and check out all the cemeteries. This is where the tale takes an unexpected turn, at least to me. He will meet an old man who lives in what the protagonist first thought was a mausoleum, but is actually a little house in a cemetery. The old man tells him how he is terrified of being buried alive, and this is because he is ill and he gets these strange attacks where he's cataleptic. He is essentially paralyzed and appears to be dead. In fact, at one point, people wanted to bury him, and it's only his mother who insisted that he wasn't going to be buried until there were signs of decomposition, and a few days later, he did start to move again. He now lives alone in this place, and he figures no one will be able to bury him against his will. And what he does is every night he will lock himself in his house, and instead of a regular bed, he actually sleeps in a coffin of some sort that he's rigged so that it can only be opened from the inside. And then the story cuts to a few years later when the protagonist visits that cemetery again and he discovers that the old man died when something went wrong with his coffin and he was trapped in it. No one knew that he was trapped until it was too late. An interesting story, though one that kind of took a 90-degree turn there in the middle. You expect that the tomb dweller is the person who's fascinated by cemeteries and all that, that maybe he'd start dwelling in the tomb, or he'd take that old man's place since he's so fascinated with cemeteries. But no, again, another ending that may be a little bit disappointing, though the overall story is well told. And it's followed by Into the Fort by Adam Hall Shirr. This is told via the conceit of several written documents. In it, we find out how a burglar who broke into some professor's house discovered a weird window. He got fascinated by it and went through it, and it turns out to be a gate to the fourth dimension. And when he came back, he discovered everything was reversed from his point of view. From our point of view, he's the one who was flipped around. We know this from the beginning. There was an explosion and a fire in that professor's house. The few written remains indicate that both the burglar and the professor went into the fourth dimension, but no one knows how to reach them, and perhaps even now they're trying to get in touch with us to get back to our world. I know there's been quite a few science fiction stories with people going into a higher dimension and then being literally flipped around, becoming a mirror image of themselves. So I don't know if that's the first time it occurred, but it's certainly one of the earlier times. I quite enjoyed this one. We then have Leopard's Trail by W. Chiswell-Collins. This is a story set in Africa. Our two protagonists are hunted down by a secret society. As they will discover, this group of people aim to have a unified, independent Africa. As it turns out, the reason they're being hunted is because of something one of them did during a war that occurred a few years before, in which he had someone executed for being a spy. One of the people involved in the society was the brother of the spy and wants to take his revenge. The men actually don't do that much. I mean, they get captured, they're tied up, and in the end they will be freed by an acquaintance of theirs who is a member of the society, who's decided that they shouldn't be killed. They're not proactive and figuring out how to get out of the trouble they're in on their own. They get help. One of the things I found weird is there's a note at the end of the story saying how this leopard society is apparently a real thing. And I have no idea what that's doing there. The story was so-so. As adventure tales go, we've seen better in Weird Tales and elsewhere. We've also seen worse, so I can't recommend it, but I can't steer you away from it either. It's followed by Hunger by Frank Owen. A bit of a disappointment after the previous story published in Weird Tales by this author. One I really liked, The Man Who Lived Next Door to Himself. This one is about what appears to be a homeless person. He's also handicapped, both physically and mentally, and whilst stealing food, will get caught and in the fight will kill the shop owner. He will then be arrested and condemned and willy-nilly go to his ultimate fate, not realizing what's happening the whole time. So I found this disappointing. It just didn't seem to have much of a point. The protagonist is more helpless than anything else. It's followed by Four Wooden Stakes, A Tale of Vampires by Victor Rowan. This one was more fun, even though fairly straightforward. The main protagonist is asked to come over by an old college friend of his. He'll discover that he's the last surviving member of his family, all his others having succumbed to a strange sickness where they get weaker and weaker even though they eat more and more. The protagonist will suspect from various clues that it's a vampire. They will discover where the vampires are. There's 4 of them. And they will stick the eponymous wooden stakes in their hearts. That was a nice little tale, told more like a mystery story than a horror tale. Next is An Unclaimed Reward by Strickland Gillilan. This one concerns some young protagonists who will see what seems to be a fugitive from the law and be seen by him, not wishing for word of his presence there to be disseminated. He will keep them with him. And the man will be going to a house where a woman is. He'll go inside with the woman and they will stay outside, and they hear crying from both the woman and the man coming from the house. Then the man leaves them be and they get to go back home unharmed. The next day, they find out that the man is indeed an escaped prisoner. He'd asked to go see his wife but was refused, and the three actually ignore the rather substantial reward offered for the recapture of the man in question. It's a well-told tale, though I didn't enjoy it as much as the previous story by this author, When We Killed Thompson. Both have in common unusual events and a narrator that's maybe not 100% reliable because of their emotional involvement in the story they're telling. And next is The Brown Mocassin by David Baxter. This is one of those stories where all the characters are actually animals in a little pond and nearby river. We see nature's course play out with sometimes some funny scenes, though a little bit grim. I kind of like these little vignettes. They're kind of fun. We can totally see how things like the Disney nature specials grew out of it. Next is The Magic of Nippon. In this one, a man who has been to Asia and brought back many things gets married, but his wife becomes sick and she will dream of a beautiful kimono. And when she describes the dream, she is told that this is the kimono of death, that anyone who wears it will die. And the fact that she'd seen it in her dream meant she was close to death herself. What is predicted does happen. And this is when the man, in a discussion with his servant, finds out that he helped matters along to avenge his sister, whom the man had apparently wronged. Nothing can be done since the magic of Nippon leaves no proof. It was a little bit long for what it did. The ending comes a little bit out of nowhere. A bit more foreshadowing would have been good, but it's okay otherwise. Next is Wanderlust by Proxy by Will Smith. And in this one, a man who is quite ill managed to make a strange invention. And he spent the last few years of his life with this strange mask or helmet or combination of both that only shows the bottom half of his face, so it covers his eyes. Then we find out that 5 years previously, he hired somebody who has similar tastes but is in good health. And using this invention, will be able to see, hear, and smell what the other person is seeing, hearing, and smelling. Since he's always wanted to travel the world, he sends this healthier man to do these travels for him and let him experience it by proxy, as the title suggests. This might very well be the first time something like telepresence and or virtual reality. The helmet today, we described it as a virtual reality helmet. Obviously, about a century ago, they didn't have these terms and concepts, so it's a bit more described from scratch. I greatly enjoyed this story, and I quite highly recommend it as a good example of how what seems complete fantasy and imagination can become something that is close to reality many, many years later. We then have For Sale, A Country Seat by Helen Liello. This one is what we would today call a Scooby-Doo plot. Some people buy a house out in the country. It's rumored to be haunted. They decide they're going to stay there and get to the bottom of things. Eventually it's found out that the real estate agent, because he makes a nice commission on selling the house multiple times, fakes the hauntings. So nothing very memorable here. That's followed by Sea Change by Henry S. Whitehead. This is about a man who is sick. He apparently has some sort of thyroid problem, which, if he does not take his daily medication, will cause him to revert to some sort of horrible form. He'll become all twisted and weak. While he's on a cruise with his wife, who does not know about his condition, they will be shipwrecked. While they are saved by some natives of the island where they're on, they also find out that no boat is going to come by for months, if not a year, and he only has about a week's worth of pills. What he decides to do is to swim out to the wreck of the boat they were on, which they can see. As he does, he realizes that the wreck is much further than he thought. He thinks he's starting to fall prey to his illness, that he's weakening, decides to turn back, and as it turns out, his harrowing experience trying to swim out and then back again has changed him. His body is now fit. He does not need the medicine anymore. I have to admit, the ending kind of threw me a bit. I kept expecting him to turn into some sort of sea monster thing, in part because of the title, in part because of the way it's said that his condition will transform his body. This author seems to like happy endings sometimes, as his first story, Tea Leaves, showed. It's nice occasionally to see a story that does not end in bad things happening to the protagonist. Speaking of bad things, the next story is The Wolf of the Campagna by Harry Bailey. This is narrated by Ramiro Dorco, who in the story is known as the titular wolf. He is a man-at-arms who works for Cesare Borgia. He is feared by most people. He will meet a young girl and fall in love with her. She does not know who he is, and he does not reveal it, though he does reveal who his employer is. At some point, Cesare Borgia will meet the girl. He also falls in love with her and will force things in order to get her. However, he does not account for the fact that she does not want him and will rather kill herself than be with the Borgia. Borgia, being Borgia, will take his anger out on his man-at-arms, and the story ends with him being hanged. I like the setting, I like the narration. It is fairly predictable where this story will go, though. And that's followed by The Master of Hell by Gordon Philip England. This is narrated by a man who seems to go down to hell and witness what happens there, and he tries to escape and manages to do so. And then he wakes up from what the doctors call the cataleptic fit. He chooses not to contradict them because he's worried that if he was to talk about his experience, people would have him committed to a different kind of hospital. Yet he now worries about what will happen when he dies. And next is the second part of Wings of Power by Lady Anne Bonny. And in it, we see how the plot thickens. The professor who is trying to further his research about zodium, some sort of radioactive metal, whose radiations allow you to hypnotize and control people, is continuing his research. Meanwhile, his stepdaughter, who he has under control, is in contact with his nephew. He is trying to cure her. She seems to have some sort of split personality disorder. And that's because, of course, she is being controlled in order that the professor can manipulate his nephew in a way that he will inherit the fortune of the family. There's also an attempt to kill his nephew so that he can, as sole relative, inherit the fortune. However, this attempt fails, and the episode ends with him vowing to find a way to get his hands on the fortune. Fairly standard plot, a bit convoluted sometimes, I admit. We'll see how it ends, and hopefully it is well. And that's followed by The Scarf of the Beloved by Greye La Spina. This is about a couple of grave robbers who dig out a body at night, of course. They do try to cover their tracks, but it's of course not perfect, and time will help erase any signs. He does find a scarf and he picks it up, and as he does, he notices it looks like the scarf of somebody he knew. They make their way back in the dark. When they deliver the body, he finally sees it, and it turns out that it's the body of his dead bride. I quite like the story, but I find the conclusion falls flat. I would assume that you know where the tomb of your bride is, and that if you were going to dig up bodies for money, you would avoid at least that area of the cemetery. Or you don't care and it wouldn't shock you. I don't know. This just didn't do much for me. This is followed by the statement of Randolph Carter. The Old Geek has done a reading. I will link to that up in the corner. I highly recommend you go and listen to him do it. He does a great job of it. This is a reprint from a story that was published a few years before in The Vagrant. It really shows an early piece of Lovecraft where somebody encounters horror so awful that it cannot be described and the consequences of it. I quite liked it. There are hints of the Lovecraft universe that are there, but they're not named yet. It is one of the better Lovecraft stories, if you ask me. It's followed by a short essay called Death by James C. Barden, which seems to say that death itself is not painful and retells of some examples that would seem to indicate that. Not very convincing in my mind. Next is Pharian by Louise Garwood. This is a story of a young woman who pines for the man she loved. It turns out she poisoned him, and while somebody else has been accused and sentenced to death for the murder, everything reminds her of him. When she finally tries to confess to the police, they believe it's because she is distraught in her grief. The tale will end with her deciding that she will join her lover. This one was quite well written. It was quite enjoyable. Very reflective piece, not too much action. Most of it is the inner monologue of the main character. Then is The Jungle Presence by Dick Heine. This one's set in Burma, in the jungles. It's very hot. The main character can't seem to sleep. He feels a weight on himself, and it turns out there's a giant cobra that's about to attack him, and he's saved at the very last minute by the Chinese servant boy in his employ who'd heard something and took some time to go find a gun to kill it. Kind of not very memorable tale overall. And finally, we have the Eerie, talking about the feedback they've received, people wanting weird tales to remain weird, though some still don't want too much gruesome or shocking or offensive content, to which they mentioned that the final soliloquy by Juliet in the play by Shakespeare could be considered too far by some people were it to be found in the pages of Weird Tales and not a classic play. They also give a teaser as to what's coming in the next few issues and go over the favorite stories for the December issue, which the reader's all-time favorite was Death Waters by Frank Belknap Long, closely followed by The Death Clinic, The Valley of Teheman, The Earth Girl, and The Hand from the Deep. To see what my opinions of those are, you can always just go and see my review of that issue. I'll try and put a link somewhere if I remember.
This issue also has a couple of stories that follow the Eerie. The first one is called That White Superiority by George Ballard Bowers. I have to admit that title kind of made me cringe. And this is about a guy who is in the Philippines somewhere up in the mountains, and he asks one of the locals who has just been to Manila in what way he believes that the white man is superior to him. It does mention that in a kind of condescending way that the locals think themselves quite the equals of anyone else, which, true. After going over what he would have seen in Manila of modern technology, cars, phones, electrical lights, etc., they also talk about what these tribespeople are like, how they have irrigated these terraced fields up in the mountains where they live, and the answer that the guy will give him is simply that you can make water flow uphill because he'd seen a fountain. anyone who knows anything about irrigation of terraced fields would know how a fountain works. It's really not clear if this story is actually poking holes at the idea of white superiority. If it's trying to, it's too subtle, I think, for it to be clear, or it's of its time. Either way, this is a page that could not have been in the magazine and wouldn't have made it worse. The next and last story is The Figure of Anubis by Edward Podolsky. This is about a man who is in Egypt. He's with an archaeologist. He will discover a mummy. Unfortunately, the only place they can store it temporarily is in his tent. He will have a fairly horrible dream where he believes the mummy to be his deceased love, who passed away a year before. And then he sees the mummy. Standing over it is the figure of Anubis, lit by the early rays of sun in the dawn. And that's where the story ends. So we don't know what happened to this figure of Anubis. Did it disappear? How did he escape, if it was after him, or anything like that? It's very disappointing story in that sense. It doesn't really have an end. I thought the scan was missing a page. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the February 1925 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.